Snow still covered the Ardennes. Thousands of burned-out tanks and frozen bodies marked what had just become Hitler's final offensive in the West. The German gamble had failed. The U.S. Army was advancing again. Ahead of them lay something rare in modern warfare, a retreating enemy compressed into narrow corridors, short on fuel, ammunition, and air cover. American field commanders believed the moment had arrived to do what armies dream of but rarely achieve: encircle and annihilate an entire enemy force. Yet that moment never came. The German armies escaped. For decades, critics have asked the same question. Why didn't Eisenhower close the trap? Why did he restrain Patton? Why did the war continue for 4 more months, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, when one decisive blow seemed possible? The answer is not simple, and it is not conspiratorial. It lies at the intersection of logistics, coalition warfare, political reality, and hard operational mathematics, not glory. To understand Eisenhower's decision, we must go back to how close the Allies really were to collapse just days earlier.
Before anyone could ask why Eisenhower allowed German forces to escape, the Allies first had to survive the greatest German counteroffensive of the war. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, slammed into thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. Hitler's objective was not symbolic, it was operational: split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. For 10 days, the situation bordered on catastrophe. Entire American divisions were shattered. Communications collapsed. Weather grounded Allied air power, their greatest advantage. In Washington and London, there were real fears that the German attack could prolong the war well into 1946. By December 23rd, the weather finally broke. Allied aircraft returned. German fuel shortages became critical. The offensive stalled. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, but it had not yet turned into a rout. What followed was not a chase, but a slow, grinding reversal fought across frozen roads and destroyed infrastructure. This context matters, because armies that have just survived disaster do not instantly gain freedom of maneuver.
As German forces withdrew, many officers believed the enemy was vulnerable to encirclement. Maps seemed to show narrow corridors near Bastogne and Houffalize. To later critics, it appeared obvious: close the jaws, destroy the German armies, end the war by Christmas. But maps lie. The terrain of the Ardennes favored defense and withdrawal. Road networks were few, bridges were destroyed. American supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Normandy ports. Fuel shortages now affected both sides. Eisenhower faced a problem Sun Tzu warned about centuries earlier. A cornered enemy does not collapse, it fights harder. German units, though battered, remained disciplined. They withdrew in organized formations, protected by rear guards, artillery, and the last operational armor available. Attempting a rapid double envelopment would have required speed the Allies did not yet possess, and casualties they could not politically justify. This was not hesitation, it was calculation.
Eisenhower was not fighting one battle. He was fighting a coalition war. Every major decision had to balance American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces, each with different priorities, logistics, and political expectations. Montgomery's cautious northern advance, Patton's aggressive southern thrust, and Soviet demands in the east all converged on Eisenhower's desk. Critics later asked why Eisenhower held Patton back. The answer lies in operational cognition, not rivalry. Patton's army was already stretched, its fuel diverted repeatedly to stabilize collapsing fronts earlier in the Bulge. A reckless drive risked overextension, the very mistake Germany had just made. Eisenhower's objective was not battlefield annihilation at any cost. It was sustained pressure across the entire front, preventing another German offensive while preparing for the final invasion of Germany itself. The decision that followed would shape not only the end of the war, but the post-war world.
The popular image of Allied armies in late 1944 is one of overwhelming abundance. The reality was far less comfortable. By the time German forces began withdrawing from the Ardennes, the Allied logistical system was under extreme strain. The rapid advance since Normandy had outrun supply depots. Antwerp, captured in September, was still not fully operational due to German control of the Scheldt estuary until late November. Much of the Allied army was still being supplied from beaches in Normandy, hundreds of miles away. Fuel was the limiting factor. Patton's Third Army, often cited as the force that could have closed the trap, was already operating on rationed gasoline, moving only when Eisenhower diverted fuel from other sectors. Artillery ammunition was restricted. Infantry replacements were scarce after the heavy losses of December. Encirclement operations are not won by intent alone. They require surplus mobility, fuel, and fresh troops, none of which the Allies had in abundance at that moment. A stalled encirclement does not weaken an enemy, it strengthens him.
Few figures loom larger in post-war criticism than General George S. Patton. Aggressive, brilliant, unapologetically offensive-minded. To many observers, the solution seemed obvious. Unleash Patton, drive north, cut off the German retreat. But Patton's Third Army was not a cavalry force racing across open plains. It was a combined arms formation dependent on fuel, bridging units, artillery coordination, and secure flanks. The Ardennes terrain, dense forests, narrow roads, destroyed bridges, neutralized speed. Moreover, Patton was already engaged in heavy fighting south of Bastogne, clearing German resistance that threatened Allied supply lines. Pulling him out for a bold dash north would have exposed American forces to counterattacks on overextended flanks. Eisenhower was not restraining Patton out of fear or politics. He was preventing operational collapse. Boldness without support wins headlines, not wars.
One comparison surfaces repeatedly in public debate. If Germany allowing the British to escape at Dunkirk was a mistake or brilliance, was Eisenhower repeating it in reverse? The analogy fails on almost every level. Dunkirk was a strategic pause born of logistical overstretch and German overconfidence, not benevolence. Hitler's forces lacked infantry cohesion and supply depth to finish the job. The British evacuation preserved an army, but it did not preserve battlefield initiative. In the Ardennes, Eisenhower faced the opposite problem. The Allies already held strategic initiative. The Germans were not escaping to regroup for a new offensive. They were retreating toward a collapsing Reich, hemorrhaging fuel, manpower, and air cover. Allowing an enemy to retreat while maintaining pressure is not mercy, it is controlled destruction.
Behind Eisenhower's decisions lay a reality most battlefield critics ignore. World War II was no longer just about defeating Germany. It was about shaping the peace that followed.
The Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east, suffering casualties on a scale unimaginable to Western publics. Soviet forces would bear the brunt of the final assault on Berlin by prior agreement among the Allies. This was not cowardice, it was coalition strategy. Every mile the Germans retreated westward was a mile they could not defend in the east. Every division not annihilated in the Ardennes was another formation that would be destroyed or surrender under sustained pressure elsewhere. Eisenhower's war was measured not in dramatic encirclements, but in inevitability. The payoff of this strategy would not be visible in January. It would be revealed in the spring.
One of the most persistent accusations leveled against Eisenhower is this, that he deliberately avoided destroying German forces so they could be used against the Soviets, or that he sacrificed American momentum to political agreements already made. The truth is more precise and less cynical. By January 1945, Allied strategy was no longer focused on singular symbolic objectives like Berlin. The city lay deep inside the Soviet operational zone, agreed upon long before the Ardennes crisis. Reaching Berlin would require crossing multiple river lines, fighting through dense urban defenses, and sustaining massive casualties, all while bypassing intact German armies elsewhere. Eisenhower understood that capturing territory without destroying enemy capability was strategically hollow. His focus was on eliminating Germany's ability to resist anywhere, not racing for flags. Berlin was not a military necessity. It was a political endpoint already assigned. The war would not end where cameras gathered. It would end when German resistance collapsed everywhere at once.
To critics, the argument seems simple. Destroy the enemy now, save lives later. But operational history shows the opposite is often true. Encirclement battles, especially against disciplined armies, are among the costliest operations in warfare. German forces retreating from the Ardennes were not broken mobs. They were experienced units fighting delaying actions with artillery, mines, and rear guards designed to bleed attackers. To close the trap, Allied forces would have had to assault fortified withdrawal corridors head-on across frozen terrain under limited air support with extended supply lines. Casualties would not have been theoretical. They would have been immediate and severe. Eisenhower measured success not by speed alone, but by loss ratios. Every unnecessary American death weakened public support and strained manpower reserves already depleted by the Bulge. The goal was not heroic destruction. It was sustainable victory.
The idea that the war could have ended in December 1944 persists because it is emotionally satisfying, not because it is militarily sound. Germany still possessed millions of men under arms, extensive defensive terrain along the Rhine, and interior supply lines far shorter than those of the Allies. The Ardennes offensive, though costly, did not destroy the German army. It merely exhausted its offensive capacity. Even if large formations had been encircled and destroyed, Germany's defensive depth would have absorbed the shock. The fighting would simply have shifted eastward and southward at immense cost. Wars rarely end from one decisive blow, especially industrial wars fought by nations already facing annihilation. Eisenhower understood this. He chose pressure over spectacle, attrition over risk. Victory was coming, but not on a calendar.
Leadership in war is often judged by what is taken, rarely by what is refused. Eisenhower's restraint after the Battle of the Bulge was not indecision, it was command maturity shaped by coalition politics, logistics, manpower realities, and the understanding that wars are won by systems, not impulses. He resisted calls for reckless pursuit. He absorbed criticism from aggressive subordinates. He accepted that history might misunderstand him. And in doing so, he preserved Allied cohesion, minimized unnecessary casualties, and ensured that Germany would face simultaneous collapse from all directions. The German forces that escaped the Ardennes did not escape defeat. They escaped one battlefield, only to be destroyed on many others. The final judgment would come not in winter, but in May.
The belief that German forces slipping out of the Ardennes returned to fight misunderstands what retreat meant in early 1945. The units that escaped were shadows of their former strength. Most lacked fuel, artillery, or air cover. Many marched on foot for days, abandoning heavy equipment along frozen roads. German records show divisions that had entered the Ardennes with thousands of men, emerging with a fraction of their original combat power. These formations were not rebuilt. Germany no longer had the industrial capacity, trained manpower, or fuel reserves to restore them. What survived the Ardennes retreat was absorbed into collapsing defensive lines along the Rhine, where Allied air power, artillery, and armor dominated completely. Escape did not equal recovery. It merely delayed surrender by weeks, not victory by months.
If the Ardennes was the last German gamble, the Rhine was the final barrier. By March 1945, Allied forces reached Germany's greatest natural defensive line. Any belief that Eisenhower's restraint had weakened Allied momentum vanished almost overnight. When the Rhine crossings began, they unfolded with speed and coordination unmatched earlier in the war. At Remagen, American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge intact, an event no encirclement in the Ardennes could have guaranteed. Within weeks, multiple Allied armies poured into the German heartland. The German units that had escaped the Bulge offered little resistance. Many surrendered en masse, others dissolved entirely. The operational collapse Eisenhower had anticipated arrived not in December, but decisively in March. This was the endgame he had planned for.
One consequence of Eisenhower's strategy is often misunderstood. As Allied armies advanced into Germany, German units increasingly sought to surrender to the Western Allies rather than fight to the end or face the Red Army. This was not coordination or conspiracy, it was survival instinct. German soldiers knew the war was lost. Their goal was no longer victory, but who they surrendered to. Eisenhower's steady, overwhelming advance created conditions where mass surrender became rational. This accelerated collapse. Entire formations laid down arms without prolonged urban combat, saving lives on all sides, including civilians trapped in Germany's cities. Destruction through inevitability proved more effective than annihilation through desperation.
By April 1945, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how the war would end. Cities fell without major battles. Resistance collapsed unevenly. Then, all at once, Hitler retreated into the bunker. Command structures disintegrated. Orders contradicted reality. The German forces that once threatened Antwerp now barely existed as cohesive units. They had not been spared. They had been consumed, methodically, relentlessly, and with fewer Allied casualties than a winter encirclement would have demanded. Eisenhower's restraint after the Bulge did not slow victory. It stabilized it. The final reckoning was approaching.
History often prefers commanders who advance fastest. It remembers less kindly those who slow the pace. George Patton embodied offensive warfare, speed, shock, relentless pressure. Bernard Montgomery emphasized preparation, caution, and set-piece battles. Eisenhower stood between them, not as a competitor, but as a coordinator. Critics later asked why Eisenhower tolerated Montgomery's delays or restrained Patton's ambitions. The answer lies in Eisenhower's role. He was not commanding an army, he was commanding an alliance. Every aggressive thrust risked exposing another sector. Every delay created friction among partners. Eisenhower's restraint was not weakness, it was arbitration under fire. He absorbed frustration so the coalition could function, and function it did.
After the war, Eisenhower addressed London's Guildhall. By then, criticism had already begun. Questions lingered about Berlin, the Ardennes, and missed opportunities. Eisenhower did not defend himself with boasts. He spoke instead of coalition unity, of the dangers of chasing glory, and of the responsibility to minimize suffering, not maximize headlines. He reminded his audience that the Allied victory had been achieved not through singular heroics, but through coordination, patience, and trust among unequal partners. This speech revealed Eisenhower's philosophy more clearly than any battlefield map. He did not believe history should be written by the fastest advance, but by the most durable peace.
Wars are often judged by what occurred, rarely by what was avoided. Modern analyses estimate that a full encirclement battle in the Ardennes, fought under winter conditions against organized resistance, could have cost tens of thousands of additional Allied casualties. These would not have shortened the war decisively, nor altered Germany's ultimate fate. Eisenhower chose a path where destruction was distributed over time, not concentrated in one catastrophic gamble. The result was fewer American dead in 1945 than in many earlier single campaigns. The soldiers who came home alive because a trap was not sprung are invisible to history, but they are central to its truth.
Some still argue Eisenhower let German forces escape so they could fight the Soviets instead. The record does not support this. German units retreating west were in no condition to mount effective resistance anywhere. The Red Army's casualties stemmed from the nature of Eastern Front warfare, not Western restraint. Others claim Eisenhower missed a chance to end the war early. But wars do not end when armies retreat. They end when states collapse. Germany's collapse occurred when its territory was overrun, its cities isolated, and its command structure shattered. Eisenhower understood that annihilation is not the same as victory.
By the spring of 1945, Eisenhower's decisions had produced a result few expected months earlier: a synchronized collapse of Nazi Germany across every front. The Ardennes escape did not save German armies. It merely postponed their destruction until it could be achieved with overwhelming force, intact supply lines, and unified command. Eisenhower never claimed brilliance. He claimed responsibility. And in war, that distinction matters.
It is easy to judge war from maps drawn after the fact, harder to command it in real time. Eisenhower refused to gamble Allied lives on an operation that promised spectacle rather than certainty. He refused to fracture the coalition for the sake of a dramatic encirclement, and he refused to turn World War II into a competition for headlines. He understood something many critics did not, that a commander's most important decisions are often negative ones, choices not to attack, not to pursue, not to risk everything for applause. In refusing to spring the Ardennes trap, Eisenhower accepted criticism in exchange for control,
He chose inevitability over improvisation. That choice defined the last months of the war.
Wars between industrial states do not end with a single battlefield triumph. They end when systems fail. Germany's system failed in stages. Fuel ran out, rail networks collapsed, air power vanished, cities were isolated. Armies became uncoordinated masses rather than instruments of strategy. The Ardennes escape did not interrupt this process. It accelerated it by pushing Germany into a defensive posture it could no longer sustain. By early April 1945, German resistance was uneven, irrational, and finally incoherent. Commanders surrendered without orders. Units dissolved overnight. This was not collapse by annihilation. It was collapse by exhaustion.
When victory came, it did not arrive with a grand encirclement in the snow. It arrived quietly. German cities fell with limited resistance. Millions surrendered. The Reich ceased to function. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed unconditional surrender. The end was not cinematic, but it was decisive. Eisenhower had not sought a single glorious moment. He sought an ending that could not be undone. That is why there was no second Ardennes, no revived German front, no negotiated peace. Only silence. History often elevates battlefield audacity and underestimates strategic patience. But patience, when informed by realism, can be the highest form of command. Eisenhower was not a tactical genius like Patton, nor a set-piece planner like Montgomery. He was something rare, a commander who understood that winning the war mattered more than winning arguments. He absorbed criticism, he restrained ambition, he balanced alliances under unimaginable pressure. And when the war ended, it ended completely. That was his achievement.
So why did Eisenhower let German forces escape after the Battle of the Bulge? Because destroying them in that moment would not have ended the war. Because closing the trap would have cost lives without changing the outcome. Because coalition warfare demands discipline, not impulse. And because victory is not measured by how loudly it arrives, but by how final it is. The German armies that escaped the Ardennes did not escape defeat. They escaped one battle and surrendered in a war that was already lost. That was Eisenhower's calculation. And history proved him right. If you're watching this on television, subscribing works a little differently. On your screen, move up to the channel name and select @WW2 Memoir. That's @WW2 Memoir. We publish in-depth World War II documentaries like this, always. Not headlines, not myths, but the decisions that shaped history. If you value serious history, subscribe to @WW2 Memoir.